This is part 4 of the Iron Islands. In part 1, I gave a general overview of the Iron Islands and how they were first settled. In part 2, I talked about life on the Iron Islands and their reaving culture. In part 3, I talked about the beginning of the Ironborn history and began to work our way through their timeline, stopping at the height of their power. This video, let's talk about the decline of the Ironborn. So Corrid Hor I ended his bloody reign, and the kings that followed him played a part in the decline of the Ironborn. The other part that helped in their decline was the Mainlanders, who had been growing stronger over the centuries. Finally, the first men of the mainland were building stone walls and long ships to combat the Ironborn. And before, the Mainlanders that dared to live near the water offered tributes to the Ironborn to be left alone. But as their power grew and the Ironborns decreased, the Mainlanders on the coast decided they weren't happy paying tribute anymore. The first to stop paying were the gardeners in the high towers during the reign of King Theon III Greyjoy. King Theon sailed against them but was slain by Lord Lyman Hightower, called the Sea Lion. After defeating them, Lord Hightower brought the practice of thraldom, or indentured servitude, back to Old Town just long enough to set the Ironborn captured during the battle to work strengthening the city's walls. Because when you get the upper hand over a bully that's been tormenting you for hundreds of years, you need to rub their nose in it a bit. The Westerlands also fought back against the Ironborn as their strength grew. Gilbert Farman gathered up the small folk, and together they forced the Ironborn from the Fair Isle. A generation later, the town of Case was captured by the Lannisters when Herrick the Whoreson blew his great gold-banded horn and the town whores opened a gate to his men. After losing the city, the Ironborn would fight to win the city back, and 3 Ironborn kings in a row would fail to do so. 2 of the kings died by Herrick's hands, or rather sword. But the Westerlands weren't done with the Ironborn that had caused them such terror in the past. Gerald Lannister, King of the Rock, remembered as Gerald the Great, decided it was time for a little bit more payback. Gerald sailed his own fleet to the Iron Islands and took 100 Ironborn hostages. And because that wasn't badass enough, he kept the Ironborn hostages in Casterly Rock, and every time an Ironborn decided to raid his shores, he'd hang one. These humiliations were followed by a century where weaker Ironborn kings lost control of the Arbor, Bear Island, Flint's Fingers, and most of the Ironborn locations along the Sunset Sea until only a few remained. But it's important to know that the Ironborn weren't completely defeated during this time, even if their triumphs were short-lived. Balon V Greyjoy, called Cold Wind, managed to destroy the fleets of the King in the North. Eric V Harlaw retook Fair Isle in his youth, but lost it when he grew old. His son Harrow killed Gareth the Grim of Hightower under the walls of Old Town. Joron I Blacktide would capture Giles II Gardener 50 years later when their fleets fought off the Misty Islands. Joron also tortured Giles to death, then cut his corpse into pieces so that he could bait his fishhooks with a chunk of king. He then earned the nickname Maiden's Bane when later in his reign he swept across the Arbor and took every woman on the island under 30 years of age. But again, despite these victories, they were short-lived, and the Ironborn continued to weaken as the Mainlanders grew in strength. Late in the Age of Heroes, the Ironborn would be dealt another unlucky blow. This unlucky blow occurred when King Uragon III Grey-Iron, or Uragon the Bald, died, and his younger sons tried to cheat the system, hoping one of them would be picked for the next king. They convened in Kingsmoot while their elder brother Torgon was raiding the Mander, but their plan backfired. Instead of choosing one of the sons, the captains picked Urathon Goodbrother of Great Wick. Not liking that the sons of the last king tried to cheat the system, Urathon commanded the sons to be executed. This was just the first of many cruel things Urathon, later known as Bad Brother, did throughout his 2 years as King of the Iron Islands. Finally, Torgon would return to the Iron Islands and declare that since he wasn't present to make a claim, the Last Kingsmoot was invalid. Because of Urathon's awful rule, the priests were eager to agree with Torgon, and soon great lords and small folk arose to the priest's call and rallied to Torgon's banners. The support for Torgon grew until Urathon's own captains hacked Urathon into pieces, and despite never being chosen at a Kingsmoot, Torgon the Latecomer became the new king for 40 years. And Torgon tried his best to lead the Ironborn and was considered a strong king who was fair-minded and just. But the Ironborn had been on such a decline that he had little power to stop it. During his reign, most of the Cape of Eagles was lost to the Maelsters of Seaguard. Torgon, who had been chosen as a king without a Kingsmoot, soon thought to put his son on the throne after him in the same manner, further spitting on the priests of the drowned god. Torgon, in his old age, kept his son at his side for 5 years to help him rule. He was beside him during court and council and in war and peace. Finally, when Torgon died, Uragon took over the Iron Islands as Uragon IV Grey Iron, with no Kingsmoot called, yet no one seemed to protest this natural progression. Uragon ruled the Iron Islands in a mostly undistinguished reign, but he did serve to do one major thing. He finally took the power away completely from the Kingsmoot and those that would assemble by having his dying wish be that his kingship pass to his great-nephew, Euron Greyiron, the Salt King of Orkmont known as Euron Redhand. But the priests of the drowned god had decided their power had been taken away for too long, and a Kingsmoot must be convened in order to decide the next king. Redhand would not be the next king unless the Kingsmoot decided it. So the priests summoned captains and kings to Old Wick once more for a Kingsmoot to decide who should rule next. Hundreds answered the priest summons, including the Salt and Rock kings from all 7 major isles, even from the Lonely Light. Redhand had other plans though, and didn't want to lose his kingship, so he waited until the men gathered before Redhand had his axemen kill the captains and kings. Naga's bones ran red with the gathered men's blood, and 13 kings died that day along with 100 priests and prophets. This was the end of the Kingsmoot, and Euron Redhand ruled as king for 22 years afterwards, and then his descendants ruled after him. Redhand had successfully taken the power from the priests and prophets of the drowned god, and it would be a long time before they ever made kings once again. In part 5, we'll talk about the Grey Irons and the Whores. Thank you for watching. Please give the video a thumbs up, it helps a lot, and come back for more Game of Thrones, Star Wars, comics, and more.